This is the iPhone 14 Plus, in blue, of course, the best new color. And the big question for this is, did Apple miss the mark? The goal here is to make the iPhone 14 with a large screen accessible to a larger number of people. But initial order reports for this thing have not been all that promising. So today I want to talk about everything that Apple did not tell you about this phone, and specifically comparing it to the 14 Pro Max and the 13 Pro Max. And basically, I want to find out, is this phone pointless? Let's get started. Today's video is sponsored by Squarespace, the #1 tool to build your beautiful online presence. Okay, so let's be honest. If you are looking at the new iPhone 14 Plus, that means you're probably also cross-shopping with the 13 Pro Max and 14 Pro Max. This is kind of the holy trinity of the big phones, and this is what most people are going to be choosing between. And conveniently, right now they happen to be very well staggered. The 128GB iPhone 14 Plus, well, that's going to cost about $899. If you want to get a 13 Pro Max, well, you can find those on sale for $1,000. And if you want to buy the 14 Pro Max, it's, you guessed it, $1,099. So with these $100 increments, there's a lot to choose from. But new colors are basically all Apple has to visually differentiate the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus from last year's phones, because they're basically identical on the outside. So all of the improvements are coming on the inside. I mean, for one, Apple says the A15 Bionic that they pulled straight out of last year's 13 Pro has a new cooling solution, and that both the iPhone 14 Pro and the regular 14 have more efficient cooling, whatever that means. Apple is claiming that the cameras have been spec bumped both on the rear and the front. And of course, the big one that I'm really interested to test is they say that the 14 Plus has the best battery life of any iPhone ever. Well, let's get to the bottom of this. So to start off with a classic Geekbench 5 run, there's honestly not very much different here. The iPhone 13 Pro Max scored 4830, the 14 Plus 4578, and the 14 Pro Max, of course, with the new A16 Bionic chip, beat both of them with 5541. Now, Geekbench, as we all know, isn't that representative of real-world performance, but it is interesting to see the iPhone 13 Pro Max slightly beating the new 14 Plus, because that's not the only time that I saw results like that. When I ran Antutu benchmark on all three of these devices, I was surprised to note that while the iPhone 14 Plus did beat the 13 Pro Max overall, in the CPU test, it actually fell ever so slightly behind. In the GPU test, the 13 Pro Max and the 14 Plus were basically tied, as you would probably expect, and the iPhone 14 Pro Max, as you would also expect, beat both of them pretty significantly. Now, where things got a little bit interesting was the memory test, because that revealed that the 14 Plus scored right in between the 13 Pro Max and the 14 Pro Max, suggesting that Apple does have slightly faster memory in the 14 Plus. Now, are you going to notice that difference? Probably not. I never would have unless there was a number in front of me, and realistically, even if this guy does have slightly faster memory than the 13 Pro Max, I'm not going to notice that before I notice the lack of ProMotion. So while it's very interesting that the iPhone 14 Plus showed consistent, albeit very minor differences in the CPU, the GPU compared to the 13 Pro Max is literally just the same. I ran 3D Mark on all three phones, and as you might expect, it was less than 10 points difference between the 13 Pro Max and the 14 Plus, with the 14 Pro Max beating both by a couple of percent. Again, the A16 is not a massive jump over the A15 in terms of performance, but if we're being honest, once again, do you really need that? The real reason that I wanted to run these tests was that new cooling system. Number one, I wanted to see if it made a difference on performance, and well, it did not. And number two, I wanted to see a difference in temperatures. So I took surface measurements of all three of these phones. After running the Antutu benchmark, the 14 Pro Max was at 33.1 degrees at its hottest point, compared to 32.7 for the 14 Plus and 37 degrees on the 13 Pro Max. Now, those numbers might not mean that much to you, but in the real world, the 13 Pro Max does feel noticeably warmer when under load. So it seems like Apple's new cooling solution, whatever that entails, does actually entail some better temperatures. Okay, so next up, we gotta talk cameras and battery. But first, let's get a word from today's video sponsor. Apple is clearly seeing the merits of opening up their larger screens to non-pro devices, and that's exactly why I've been using today's video sponsor, Squarespace, to build a website designed to promote my ultimate dream, a 15-inch MacBook Air. Thanks to Squarespace's easy-to-use and customizable templates, I put this site together in mere moments. And I even set up a quick online storefront to display some merchandise to help support my 15-inch MacBook Air cause. Look, it's the perfect sweet spot between big screen, affordable price, and good enough performance while also being thin and light. So I think we can all agree that Apple needs to make this thing right away. And if and when they finally do, I'll be able to notify my loyal followers thanks to email campaigns that can keep them in the loop on all the latest developments. Squarespace has all the tools to build out my petition and make it presentable. So check out squarespace.com to get a free trial. And when you're ready to publish your website, go to squarespace.com/LukeMiani to save 10% on your first purchase of a website or domain. And now let's get back to the iPhone 14 Plus. iPhone camera technology has been a consistent year-over-year upgrade for the entire existence of the phone. Apple knows that people use their iPhone cameras more than probably any other camera in their life, and it's very important to them that we all know that they made a tiny little tweak and made something a little bit better. However, this year, the iPhone 14 Pro Max really stands out because they changed a lot. That new 48 megapixel sensor is really, really impressive. But Apple claims that the 14 Plus has some improvements too. Better low light, better ultra wide, better quality in general. And to find out, I took some photos with all three of these phones. So first up here on the prime lens, you can really see the biggest difference when you compare the 13 and the 14 Plus to the new 14 Pro. That big sensor makes a ton of difference. You can really see a lot of extra detail in these photos. But the thing that I want to make clear is that you really only appreciate those differences when you zoom in and you retouch and you really get into the details. And that's all great, and I love to have it. Those big 50, 60 megabyte, 48 megapixel photos are phenomenal. However, for just casual picture taking, you would be hard pressed at a distance to see that much of a difference between really any of these phones. And that goes for the front-facing camera as well. This year, the 14 series has autofocus, where the camera on the 13 Pro Max is supposedly worse. But if you look at these photos side by side, unless you get really, really granular, you're probably not gonna see that much of a difference. Where you will probably notice a difference is ultra-wide photos in low-light situations. The 14 cameras are definitely an improvement over the 13, but again, these are mainly things that you're gonna notice in side-by-side photo comparisons. Let me tell you, if you're just sitting on your phone and you scroll back and forth between the three different photos from these three different phones, I couldn't tell you which one is different unless I swipe up and I go, oh, this one's from the 14 Plus, how about that? To simplify things for you, I've created a lineup of how I would rank all of these phones in various different situations. So I'm just gonna pop that up on the screen. The long and the short of it is, the iPhone 14 Plus I think has the weakest system, the iPhone 13 Pro Max in second, and the 14 Pro Max is just unbelievable. You just can't beat that. But enough about cameras. The long and the short of it is they're all really good and it's up to personal preference. I want to talk about battery, because I think battery life is probably one of the most important features of any phone, and Apple is very clearly and boldly stating that this phone has the best battery life of any iPhone ever made. Well, you know I'm gonna have to put that to the test and pit it against these guys for the ultimate battery showdown. So for the final part of this video, I want to talk about battery because that is the #1 selling point that Apple emphasizes for the 14 Plus. They claim that this has the best battery life of any iPhone to ever exist. Yet on Apple's own website, the stats for the 14 Pro Max that they quote are actually higher in most cases than the 14 Plus. Now, Apple says that that's not the case in reality, that those particular rated times aren't reflective of the actual day-to-day usage of this phone. So, how else are we going to figure this out than some day-to-day usage tests? And boy, do I have them lined up for you. To put these phones to the test, I did an hour of nonstop testing on the 14 Plus, 14 Pro Max, and 13 Pro Max. And it consisted of an hour of 4K video recording, an hour of YouTube playback, and then 2 hours of miscellaneous social media and sitting on the home screen to have a control, because at some point you're gonna be on your home screen. So I think this offers a pretty good look at what you might actually do with your phone in a given day over a 4-hour period. And of course it's standardized, so I'm doing the exact same motions on all of the different phones. After the initial hour of recording 4K video at 30 FPS, the 13 Pro Max was at 82%, the 14 Plus at 86%, and the 14 Pro Max at 85%. After an hour of YouTube, the 13 Pro Max was down to 78%, the 14 Plus at 81%, and the 14 Pro Max at 80%. Next came 30 minutes of TikTok, leaving us at 74%, 78%, and 76%. Then 30 minutes of Twitter, resulting in 71, 75, and 72. Then 30 minutes of Reddit scrolling, 69, 72, 68. And finally, 30 minutes of just leaving it on the home screen with the brightnesses all adjusted to be the same, 66, 70, and 65. So based on this testing, it does indeed appear that the 14 Plus has better battery life than the 14 Pro Max. And interestingly enough, you notice that the gap started to widen a little bit as I got into the social media tests. And I suspect that's because all of a sudden we're scrolling, we're using ProMotion, we got those smooth animations. So if you're doing a lot of scrolling, that's gonna take up some battery. Now, it's not a big difference, right? We only got it to be 5% different. And realistically, I think the 13 Pro Max would have done a lot better if it was on a completely brand new fresh battery. Mine's a year old, it's at 96% capacity. So you can probably add a couple percent to the 13 Pro Max, and I would call it nearly indistinguishable, but technically the 14 Plus offers the best battery life of any iPhone that I've ever tested. However, if you are deciding between these three phones, then I highly doubt that even that 5% spread that we got to at the end would sway you. In fact, all of the differences that I have pointed out in today's video, from the thermals, performance, camera quality, video quality, and battery life, the only differences that you're really going to see is when you have the phones side by side. And that leaves the iPhone 14 Plus in a pretty tough spot, because when you compare it directly against the iPhone 13 Pro Max, which in a couple of months is going to be the same exact price, I really don't see any reason to pick the 14 Plus over the 13 Pro Max. Nothing from the tiny difference in camera quality to the tiny difference in battery life or thermal performance is noticeable on a daily basis. But what you will notice when you get the 14 Plus instead of a 13 Pro Max is that you don't have ProMotion. You don't have the telephoto lens. You don't have the stainless steel, more sturdy enclosure. Those are things that actually make a difference, unlike 2% better battery after 3 hours of scripted testing. So who is the iPhone 14 Plus actually for? Who is going to buy this phone? This phone is for the person who has an older iPhone, like an iPhone 8 Plus or an iPhone XS Max or something from a couple of years ago, and they want to get a new phone and they want a big screen. So they go to the Apple Store and they say, hey, what's your biggest phone? And the Apple Store says, well, you get the 14 Pro Max or the 14 Plus. And they say, well, what's the difference? And they say, well, one is $900 and one's $1,100, and the $1,100 one has better cameras and a high refresh rate display and a dynamic island. To which the person responds, well, I don't know what any of that is, so I'll just take the cheaper one. And there you have it. That's the iPhone 14 Plus customer. So yeah, I think this is a phone that makes sense for the unknowing population out there who does not care about their phone. They just want a big one. But apart from that, I probably would advise against buying the iPhone 14 Plus. If you can get a 13, that's probably the better move. As usual, thank you guys so much for watching. I will see you in the next one.